Welcome, my dear. Come in slowly, take off the weight of your day, and close the door gently behind you. Let the hush of this space wrap around you like velvet, soft and dark and warm. You're here now, and nothing outside matters. Not the ticking of the clock, not the emails unopened, not the calls unanswered. Tonight is about surrendering to something else, something quieter, deeper, slower. A story, yes, but also a feeling, a temperature, a heartbeat. Breathe with me. Let your shoulders drop. Let your mind wander. I'll take care of the rest. What you're about to hear isn't loud or fast. It doesn't scream for attention. It lingers. It tempts. It waits for your body to settle into the rhythm of desire, disguised as narration. Because this isn't just a story. It's an atmosphere. A moment suspended in candlelight and wine, and glances held too long, and silence used like language. And you, listening now, you are part of it. Your presence changes the story. Your breath fuels it. So if you enjoy sinking into the night like this, if you want more stories whispered like secrets, I invite you gently, slowly to touch the heart of this platform. Like subscribe, leave a trace. Feed the quiet algorithm that keeps us connected. This tale begins with two people who never planned to meet like this. One of them, a woman of ambition and elegance, came for numbers, for business, for control. She carries her confidence like perfume, intoxicating, expensive, and carefully measured. She doesn't believe in distractions, and least of all in the kind that involve messy kitchens, fire, and men who cook with their hands, and their mouths equally. The other, a man of spice and solitude, never expected a guest that night. His life, mostly folded into flour and garlic, heat and repetition, wasn't supposed to change course because of one unexpected knock at the door. But it did. Oh, it did. And the way it changed wasn't loud. It was soft, slow. It began with a plate. He cooked for her. Not to impress, not to seduce. Simply because that's what he does. He creates flavors that make people pause mid-sentence. He doesn't know her, but he sees her. And she, against her own rules, lets herself be seen. Not just in her polished shoes or the way she grips her wine glass, but in the flicker of something deeper. Hunger, not the kind that lives in the stomach. So stay with me. Let me tell you how a plate became a question, how a bite became a look, and how, in a night carved out of time, two strangers forgot who they were supposed to be and remembered what it felt like to want. Ready? Let's begin. The city had already fallen quiet by the time she stepped inside. Outside, the streets of stone and glass had been muted by mist, and the distant hum of traffic blurred into a low, metallic lullaby. Behind her, street lamps flickered through a veil of fog, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain and exhaust. But once she crossed the threshold, the world narrowed to something hushed and golden. Here, there were no screens, no noise, no decisions to make. Just warmth, just shadow, just scent. Candles flickered along shelves of wine-dark bottles. The walls were of worn stone and old wood grainy, imperfect, intimate. And the air was thick with the perfume of rosemary and charred citrus, a scent that stirred something in her ribcage. He was already there. Alone behind the counter, an apron dusted with flour tied low around his waist, sleeves rolled to the elbows, arms crossed. The firelight caught in the stubble on his jaw and shimmered in his eyes, which watched her with the kind of stillness that disarmed. Not the stillness of someone waiting, but of someone who had already decided. She hadn't expected him to look like that. There was a ruggedness to him, but it didn't beg for attention. His age suited him, weathered, not worn, solid, scarred in the right places. She paused not for effect, but because her feet did. Her breath hitched. She'd entered hundreds of rooms before, owned them even. But something about this space, about this man, made her feel like a guest in her own body. Their meeting had been arranged by a friend. Casual. He's in trouble, the friend had said, swirling a glass of wine one late evening. But not the kind he'll admit. He's brilliant. And stubborn. He needs someone who sees past the poetry. She had lifted an eyebrow. She didn't do rescue. She didn't believe in starving artists. She invested in things that grew, not crumbled. In returns, not romance. And yet, a message had come. Simple. One line. Let me cook for you. No context, no follow-up, no deck, no budget breakdown. Just that. She had reread it more than once, annoyed by how it lingered. It was presumptuous, arrogant, or maybe sincere. And it had been years since anyone had invited her into something that didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't speak as she entered, just tilted his head toward the table, one setting, one single candle. The rest of the room had been cleared, claimed for the night. A private ritual. No staff, no music. Just silence, firelight, and the echo of her own heels across the wood. The table was already set, and the first course waited. A plate low and wide, painted in soft earth tones and steam. She lowered herself into the chair with deliberate elegance, shrugged off her coat slowly. His eyes followed her, not with hunger, not with calculation, but with something quieter. Recognition, curiosity. She had never been the kind of woman to be undone by ambience. But there was something ceremonial about this night, something that wrapped around her spine and whispered, "Stay open." The dish in front of her was warm and glistening. Roasted roots, dark and sweet, balanced on a bed of something creamy and faintly spiced. A drizzle of pomegranate syrup glinted across the plate like lacquer. A crumble of salty cheese clung to the edges. And beneath it all, the scent of fire of something kissed by smoke, ancient and familiar. She inhaled, and the past brushed her cheek like a lover. He poured wine for her slowly, with reverence. A bottle uncorked in silence. A deep red, with legs that clung to the glass. She accepted it without speaking, sipped, let it roll over her tongue. It tasted like stories, like something aged in darkness and stored behind locked doors. She closed her eyes. The room faded. The first bite was quiet, fork to lips, a pause. Then heat, then cream, then tang. Her mouth bloomed with flavor, as if the dish had been composed for her alone. Sweetness gave way to smoke. Cream softened the edges of salt. And beneath it all, something ancient like the memory of a meal she'd never eaten, but somehow missed. She swallowed, opened her eyes, and found his gaze waiting for her. Not seeking approval, just watching her feel. They spoke little. Words weren't needed. His body spoke in presence. Her silence was an answer. He returned to the counter and brought the next dish hot, rounded, humming with spice. He named each ingredient softly, as if recalling the names of old friends. Millet, sumac, burnt lemon. Aleppo pepper. He spoke of grains forgotten, recipes whispered across generations, of food that outlived its makers. She listened, not because she had to, but because something in his voice grounded her. It was low and deliberate, like hands kneading dough at dawn. There was no arrogance in it, only memory, craft. She found herself leaning forward, not just for the food, but for the sound of him, the shape of his words. Between courses, they did not fill the space with chatter. They let the silences expand, warm and dense like fresh bread. Her foot brushed against his once beneath the table. Neither of them moved away. The candle trembled. Her breath slowed. At some point, she noticed her posture had shifted. Shoulders loose, legs crossed differently. She touched her collarbone absent-mindedly, as if rediscovering her own skin. The heat in the room wasn't just from the kitchen. It pulsed from somewhere more primal, more human. He brought the third course with a soft smile, and stood close enough that she could smell the starch of his shirt and the trace of garlic on his wrist. She glanced up at him, and their eyes held. Not long, just enough. Enough to feel the edge of something flickering beneath the ritual of it all. She asked, finally, what drove him. Not the restaurant, not the debt, but this. Why cook like this for someone like her? He didn't answer right away. He turned his back to her briefly, wiping the edge of a plate before turning back and saying, because it's the only way I know how to speak. She looked down at the food again, touched her fork to it, but her appetite had shifted. Now she wasn't hungry for taste. She was hungry for him, for the way he moved, for what he wasn't saying. The next bite was slower. She placed it on her tongue and let it dissolve like confession. Her eyes stayed on him. He didn't flinch, didn't turn away, just waited, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. And then, her voice softer, slower emerged between bites. Tell me, chef, why did you really want me here tonight? The second course arrived without flourish, without fanfare, as though it had simply appeared between them, conjured by silence itself. He placed it before her with the care of a musician, tuning an instrument, his fingers moving with reverence, as if the slightest tremble could disturb the delicate harmony already forming between flavors, glances, and subtle gestures. A piece of white fish, just seared and still glistening, rested atop a pale cloud of smoked cauliflower puree. Around it, drops of dill oil gleamed like dew, and a thin trail of white wine reduction curved across the plate, laced with orange zest. The dish was simple, but had the precision of a whispered verse, restrained, deliberate, seductive. She leaned forward slightly, inhaling the soft warmth rising from her plate. The aroma wasn't loud, it whispered, a gentle mixture of sea, smoke, and citrus. Her eyes met his across the table again, this time without pretense. The conversation had slowed to a hush, replaced by the language of breath and pause. Her fork moved slowly, trailing steam, slicing into the tender flake of fish. She tasted and let her eyes close just slightly. It was divine. But what unsettled her wasn't the perfection of the bite. It was the sensation that he had, somehow, cooked her a message. He didn't eat. He only watched, elbows resting loosely on the edge of the table, fingers steepled, gaze soft but steady. She noticed the way he studied her, not with arrogance, but with the quiet hunger of someone who hadn't had pleasure in some time. Not just the pleasure of touch, but of being noticed, of offering something of himself and waiting to see if it was accepted. The room held its breath between them, suspended in warmth, wood, and wine. The scent of charred butter and fresh herbs clung to his clothes and skin. There was something intimate in how he carried the kitchen with him. The world he had built, even in hardship, surrounded him like a second skin. It made her pulse tick faster. He wasn't trying to impress her in the way other men had. There was no showmanship, no empty flattery, only a raw kind of generosity, quiet and stubborn. She found herself leaning into it, drawn not just by the taste, but by the man behind it. She asked him how he'd come to create such a dish, what inspired it, and he smiled without lifting his eyes. "It's what I wanted to eat," he said simply. "So I made it for you." The sentence fell like silk across the table. Her breath hitched, just slightly, enough for her to lower her gaze and hide the ripple it caused. No one had spoken to her like that in years, direct, stripped of strategy, laced only with a kind of tender boldness. There was a burn, low in her stomach, not from the food, but from the way he existed, so tactile, so grounded. She hadn't meant to be charmed. She had come with numbers, with strategy, with an ear trained for pitch and potential return on investment. But now she was measuring risk differently. The danger wasn't in the failure of the restaurant. It was in how he made her forget the distance she kept around herself like armor. He rose quietly, clearing only her plate, not his. His hand brushed close to her wrist, just a whisper of warmth, but it lingered like a kiss that hadn't happened. She didn't move. The stillness between them was louder than any music. In the kitchen, the clink of steel on ceramic, the hiss of something fresh meeting heat. She could see his silhouette through the pass window head bent, back curved with focus, like a craftsman finishing a final brushstroke. She stood, almost without thinking, and walked slowly toward the doorway that led to the open kitchen. Her heels clicked softly on the old wood floor, each step deliberate. She leaned against the frame and watched him. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, forearms dusted with flour and shadow. The light above caught the sheen of olive oil in the pan he held, the glint of his silver ring plain worn from time. She didn't know why it mattered, only that it made her feel closer to him, more allowed. He noticed her presence, but didn't look up. "This one's a little more intense," he said, his voice low and smoky from the steam. "It bites back." She didn't answer, just watched the way his hands moved, strong, calloused, utterly sure of themselves. The fire reflected in his eyes. Her chest rose slowly, breath thick with tension she hadn't named yet. She could feel herself warming from the inside out, as though the heat from the stove was creeping under her skin. Still, he didn't touch her, not yet. And that restraint so complete, so deliberate, was its own kind of seduction. He plated with precision, finishing the dish with a few crushed pink peppercorns and a drizzle of something dark and glossy. Then he looked at her. Really looked. The moment hung between them, taut as a held breath, ripe as fruit waiting to fall. The table remained behind her, untouched, but the distance between them had shifted. It was no longer defined by chairs and courses and polite conversation. It was defined now by a single glance, a steady rhythm of breath, and the sense that this night had always been headed here. She whispered, "What's in this one?" He stepped closer, the plate still cradled between his hands, as if it were an offering not just of flavor, but of truth. The firelight from the open kitchen danced across his features, catching on the angles of his cheekbones, the curve of his mouth, the fine shimmer of oil that clung to his forearm like sweat. For a moment, he didn't answer. He only looked at her, the kind of look that doesn't ask for permission, because it already knows the answer. A gaze thick with knowing, with invitation, with all the restraint of a man who had waited too long to pretend he wasn't awaiting. "Desire," he said at last, his voice velveted by smoke and silence. "Served warm." The words landed in the space between them like a hand at the small of her back, unexpected, welcome, and electric, not crude, not coy, just true. And that truth peeled something back inside her, something she hadn't even realized had been hiding behind spreadsheets and deals and boardroom charm. She exhaled slowly, aware of how tightly she'd been holding herself all evening, aware of how close he was now, of how the plate in his hands was the last thing keeping them apart. She stepped back not to retreat, but to clear the path between them. A subtle shift of weight, a gentle tilt of her body toward the table once again. He followed wordlessly, setting the dish down in front of her with the same reverence he'd shown before. But now the air had changed. It wasn't just heavy, it was charged, as though the molecules between them had been rearranged. The candlelight flickered in time with her pulse. The scent of heat, citrus, pepper, and something more primal curled around her like breath against skin. She sat slowly, deliberately, never once breaking eye contact. The tension between them wasn't the sharp kind that cuts. It was the soft, slow kind that wraps around you and holds, warming from the inside out until it becomes unbearable not to touch. He moved to the other side of the table, mirroring her. But there was no more pretending. Every glance now was heavier. Every movement laced with the awareness that something had shifted irrevocably, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise. Her fingers brushed the stem of her wine glass, but she didn't lift it. Instead, She tilted her head slightly and asked low, almost a murmur, "Is this still business, chef?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, hands folded, eyes locked to hers with the kind of stillness that comes just before a storm. And when he did speak, it was not with cleverness, not with charm, but with heat and gravity, and a slow honesty that made her throat tighten. "No," he said, his voice no louder than a flame. "This is the part where we stop pretending it ever was." And with that, the space between them seemed to collapse, not in distance, but in intent. The air grew heavier, the flicker of the candles stretching long shadows across the table. The scent of the new dish meaty, peppery, layered with something almost sweet rose into the silence, like a promise waiting to be answered. But neither of them reached for their forks. Not yet. The hunger in the room was no longer just culinary. She leaned in slightly, elbows on the table, her face lit by amber and shadow. Her gaze wandered briefly to his mouth as he spoke again, softer now, more vulnerable. "I wasn't looking for help," he said. "I was looking for someone who might understand the kind of hunger that doesn't go away just because you feed it." She swallowed, slowly, as if every word he gave her was something she needed time to digest. Her heart beat low and insistent in her chest, loud against the hush. She didn't want to say something clever. She didn't want to dominate this moment with words. All she wanted was to stay inside it, to stay inside him, his quietness, his fire, his certainty. He reached forward then, not to touch her skin, but to adjust the plate between them, sliding it closer, nudging it into shared space. His fingertips brushed the edge of her hand light as a sigh, but devastating in its precision. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a heartbeat, the entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. Outside, the night pressed against the windows like velvet. Inside, everything slowed, thickened, deepened, and the third course waited unspoken, unfinished, not on the plate, but in the space between their breaths. The room had shifted subtly since the beginning of the evening, growing warmer in more ways than one. A golden candlelight now seemed to wrap itself around them like a soft, intimate embrace, blurring the edges of the worn stone walls and the dark wood that held their secrets. She felt the slow crescendo of tension in the air, thick and palpable, weaving itself into every glance exchanged, every silent breath they shared across the narrow expanse of the table. Her fingers trembled imperceptibly as they reached for the wine glass, the deep crimson liquid inside, catching the flickering flames and fracturing the light into shimmering fragments that danced like whispered promises across her skin. His eyes traced that movement, dark and fathomless, filled with a steady focus that made her feel simultaneously exposed and desired, as if he could read every unspoken thought fluttering behind her calm exterior. The tilt of her chin, the subtle parting of her lips, the rapid thrum of her pulse beneath the thin fabric of her blouse, like a secret tattoo only he could sense. He broke the silence then, his voice a low murmur that felt less like speech and more like a gentle caress, a warm breath against skin chilled by doubt. His words were no longer confined to descriptions of dishes or the business at hand. They had become something altogether different, an invocation of moments shared, of hunger that transcended the physical and stirred the soul. He spoke of patience and the art of waiting, comparing desire to the perfect flame that, when fed and nurtured, consumes everything it touches, leaving only the essential behind. His hands, still dusted with flour and memories of the kitchen, moved with unspoken grace, tracing arcs in the air as though he were painting a secret story meant solely for her eyes. Each gesture was deliberate, every motion charged with meaning, crafting a silent language between them that hummed beneath their words like an unending melody. Her breath caught unexpectedly, sharp and unbidden, as his every syllable seemed to kindle a flame deep within her that she hadn't known was smoldering. She had arrived that evening prepared to discuss profits, to weigh risks and numbers, to navigate the cold precision of investment decisions. Instead, she found herself unraveling slowly, thread by delicate thread, in the warmth of his presence. Each phrase he spoke, each glance he offered, tugged at the carefully constructed walls she'd built around herself, walls that now felt porous, vulnerable, dissolving under the gentle heat of the moment. It was as if the very air between them was charged with electricity, pulling her toward an uncharted space where business faded and desire took form. She met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes dark pools of questions she dared not voice aloud, but that hung heavy in the space between them like unspoken promises. The look she gave him was both an invitation and a challenge, an unsteady balance of daring and restraint. Could he hold the weight of what she hid beneath her poised exterior? Could she risk surrendering to this slow, deliberate dance that had begun a choreography of looks, touches, and pregnant silences that spoke louder than words? The answer hovered, fragile and trembling, as if suspended by the thinnest thread, waiting to snap or soar. Her fingers moved of their own accord, brushing against his wrist with a touch that was light, but purposeful, tracing the quickened pulse beneath the skin, a rhythm that seemed to echo the growing heat pooling low in her belly. The contrast of his rough, callous skin against the softness of her own sent a spark cascading through her nerves, igniting every nerve ending along the delicate curve of her arm. She was acutely aware of the tension coiling in her shoulders, the measured rise and fall of her chest beneath the fabric that had suddenly grown too tight. The scent of herbs and smoke clung to him like a dark perfume, infiltrating her senses and seeping into her pores, setting her entire being aflame with longing and curiosity. He did not withdraw from the touch. Instead, he leaned in closer, the small space between their faces shrinking, until the warmth of his breath mingled with hers like a secret shared in the dark. The flicker of candlelight caught the fine lines etched around his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jawline, the barely there curve of a smile that promised restraint and release in equal measure. His voice dropped to a whisper, rough and husky, intimate and private, meant only for her ears and heart to receive. "Desire isn't something you chase," he said softly, his breath warm against her skin. "It's something you surrender to, like letting the flame take what it will, trusting it won't burn what's worth saving." She swallowed, the complex flavors of wine and anticipation mixing on her tongue, making her head swim. Her heart beat faster, loud and insistent, drowning out the faint hum of the city beyond the kitchen's thick stone walls, the distant murmur of cars, the restless rustle of leaves caught in the night wind. Here, wrapped in this cocoon of shadow and scent, none of that existed. There was only the fire between them, slow and unrelenting, an elemental force waiting to be fed. Her hand slid from his wrist to the back of his hand, fingers curling around the rough skin with a gentle pressure that spoke volumes, both a question and an answer. His response was subtle, a squeeze that carried understanding and an unspoken promise, the quiet acknowledgement of a hunger they both shared but dared not name aloud. The contact was electric, a silent pact forged in the glow of candlelight and whispered breaths. She closed her eyes briefly, surrendering to the sensation that flooded her, the warmth of his touch, the sound of his voice, the flicker of the flame casting dancing shadows across his face. When she opened them again, the room had shrunk. The distance between them vanished like mist in the morning sun. There was nothing but the invisible thread pulling them toward one another, the gravity of proximity, the magnetic charge of shared longing that had been quietly building all evening. He reached out then, fingertips grazing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her chest tighten and pulse in time with his touch. The softness of his hand against her skin was a stark contrast to the fire smoldering in his eyes, a duality that made her feel vulnerable and cherished all at once. She tilted her face upward, breath mingling, time slowing to the gentle rhythm of two hearts leaning into the unspoken. An exquisite moment balanced on the edge of something dangerous and beautiful. No words were necessary. The charged silence between them spoke of everything, the yearning and restraint, the unquenchable hunger for more than just a meal shared across a table. It was a language spoken through the subtlest glance, the lightest touch, the charged space that pulsed with every breath. It was a symphony of desire, composed in the soft flicker of candlelight and the heat that radiated between two bodies poised on the brink of surrender. Her pulse hammered in her ears as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his fingers lingering just a moment longer to trace the curve of her cheek with reverence that made her ache in places she hadn't even remembered could feel. The rest of the world, the city, the debts, the endless negotiations, faded away like smoke, leaving only this suspended instant wrapped in flame and shadow, where the only reality was the heat that surged between them and the promise it carried. She parted her lips slightly, the warmth of his presence filling every corner of her awareness until there was no space left for doubt or distance. His breath was hot against her skin, his gaze unwavering and fierce, locking her in a moment that felt both fragile and eternal. The taste of wine, the scent of herbs, the thrill in his touch, all collided in a heady, intoxicating blend that left her breathless and wanting more than she had ever imagined possible. They were no longer chef and investor, nor strangers bound by circumstance. In that moment, they became something far more elemental, two souls igniting a fire that had been waiting patiently beneath layers of restraint, ready to blaze into life with the simplest of sparks. And in the quiet between them, as the third course sat untouched, the question lingered, heavy and unspoken. How far would they allow this flame to grow? How much of themselves would they surrender to the heat before the night's hunger was sated or consumed completely? The arrival of the fourth course did not come with the usual fanfare of clinking silverware or whispered exchanges. Instead, it descended upon them like a quiet, inevitable shift in the air, a subtle change in the rhythm of the evening that neither could ignore. The moments between them had begun to thicken, layered with a tension so delicate and electric it seemed to pulse with every breath they took. What had once been careful politeness and measured glances now wove itself into an intricate dance of proximity and restraint, where every small movement carried the weight of unspoken desire. And then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, their hands brushed a fleeting contact charged with more meaning than words could capture. The brush was accidental only in its timing. His fingers, roughened and calloused from years of working dough and flame, grazed hers as he reached for a glass, a movement so natural, yet so charged that it sent an unmistakable current coursing through her veins. The warmth of his skin against the coolness of hers created a delicious contrast, a spark that ignited a slow-burning fire deep within her chest. It was a touch that neither could deny, a magnetic pulse that drew their senses into sharp focus, the faint rustle of fabric, the quickened beat of a heart, the subtle scent of spice and wood smoke mingling in the quiet space between them. His eyes flickered down to their joined hands, hesitation and curiosity flickering behind the steady gaze. There was a vulnerability there, a bare truth laid bare in the way he held her fingers, not possessively, but as though afraid to let go of something fragile and precious. She met his look, her own breath catching in her throat as she felt the years of guarded solitude begin to melt away under the heat of his attention. The world beyond the softly lit room seemed to recede, leaving only the glow of candlelight dancing across the rough stone walls and the taut silence stretching between them. The candlelight wrapped them in its golden embrace, painting shadows that flickered and softened, outlining the curves of his face, the line of her jaw, the delicate sweep of her collarbone exposed by the slow fall of her coat. The air was thick with scent, a mingling of the herbs lingering from the kitchen, the faint trace of his cologne that carried hints of cedar and pepper, and the lingering aroma of wine and citrus from their earlier courses. It wrapped around her like a whispered promise, stirring a restlessness that had nothing to do with hunger or wine. This was a hunger born of presence, of the shared space and the electric pull of skin against skin. His voice broke the silence then, low and deliberate, each word measured, as though afraid to shatter the fragile bubble of intimacy they had crafted. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he murmured, the timbre of his tone wrapping around her like a caress. "Just be here with me, with this moment." The invitation was a balm to the nerves that fluttered beneath her ribs, a gentle coaxing to let down the walls she had built so carefully over years of pragmatism and guarded ambition. It was permission to inhabit the space between restraint and surrender, to breathe in the possibility that flickered like a flame between them. The silence that followed was rich and resonant, filled with the language of glances and subtle breaths. It was a conversation without words, an exchange of longing and restraint, anticipation and caution. Time itself seemed to stretch and fold. Every second waited with the promise of something on the cusp of revelation. She found herself acutely aware of every nuance, the slight parting of his lips as he exhaled, the faint tremor of his fingers as they lingered on the table, the gentle incline of his head inviting her closer without a single step forward. Her own hands trembled as she reached across the narrow expanse, the deliberate motion charged with intent and silent yearning. Their fingers met again, this time with purpose. The touch was slow and deliberate, a language spoken through skin and warmth rather than sound. She felt the roughness of his palm, the strength coiled beneath the surface of his skin, and the subtle warmth spreading like wildfire from their joined hands into the depths of her being. The connection bypassed thought, weaving a delicate thread of trust and vulnerability that dissolved the boundaries between them. The space defined by distance and decorum dissolved into a shared cocoon of sensation and possibility. He leaned forward then, a subtle motion that shortened the space until the faint brush of their knees beneath the table sent a shiver rippling through her. The air around them thickened, scented with the mingling of wine, spice, and the undeniable heat of bodies drawn together by a force both primal and tender. Her breath caught as she met his gaze, steady, unwavering, alive with a fire that matched the flickering candle flames between them. His eyes held a raw honesty, a vulnerability wrapped in strength that stirred an ache deep in her chest, a longing that surprised her with its intensity. The faint curve of his lips was a secret smile, a silent acknowledgment of the gravity that pulled them inexorably closer. His voice returned, barely more than a breath, a confession meant only for her ears. "I've waited a long time for someone who could see beyond the surface, beyond debts and failures," he said, his words heavy with meaning. "Someone who understands that what we build here is more than food or business." The confession settled around her like a warm blanket, both comforting and electrifying, wrapping them in an intimacy born of shared understanding and quiet defiance. His hand slid from the table to hers, fingers curling around her wrist with a tenderness that belied the strength beneath his touch. The heat that passed between them was no longer metaphorical but tangible, a living pulse that radiated from where their skin met. She did not pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, savoring the sensation, the vulnerability, the irresistible pull that drew her closer. When she opened them, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, the flickering candlelight, the scent of rosemary and citrus hanging in the warm air, the distant muted sounds of the city swallowed by thick stone walls. Time itself seemed to suspend, holding its breath as the night unfolded around their shared space. The meal was not yet finished, but the true feast was taking place in the silent exchange of touch, glances, and the slow unraveling of restraint and desire. And in that charged quiet, she knew this night had only just begun. A faint sound interrupted their cocoon, a soft scrape of a chair, the almost imperceptible shuffle of feet on the wooden floor, and suddenly the boundary between the room's intimacy and the outside world shimmered. Neither spoke, but their eyes locked with renewed intensity. an unspoken promise hanging in the air, fragile yet undeniable. The tension had settled into something more profound than anticipation. It was a shared secret, a private world that existed just beneath the surface. Her fingers tightened slightly around his wrist, the contact grounding her as waves of longing and uncertainty swelled within. She felt the subtle rise and fall of his breath, the steady rhythm of his pulse beneath her touch, and the faint scent of tobacco and spice that clung to him like a second skin. The space between them was no longer defined by physical distance, but by the weight of unspoken emotions, the quiet language of desire that transcended words and time. He tilted his head, a question without sound or movement, and she responded with a slow, deliberate nod. Their connection deepened, an invisible thread weaving them closer, drawing them out of the isolation they each carried. The world outside faded further, leaving only the glow of candlelight, the scent of simmering herbs, and the warmth of a touch that promised more than mere presence. The air grew heavier with the scent of their mingled, breath-warm, faintly spiced, intimate. She could feel the pulse of heat rising from her chest, spreading through her veins like molten gold. Every nerve ending seemed alight, tuned to the frequency of him, the strength in his gaze, the tenderness in his touch, the quiet power in his restraint. It was a delicious torment, this balance between restraint and surrender, a slow unfolding of something precious and urgent. He shifted slightly, his body leaning into the space between them as if to close the last remaining gap. Her heart hammered in response, a wild rhythm that echoed the dance of flame flickering nearby. Their eyes locked again, and she saw there the flicker of vulnerability, desire, and something deeper, an invitation to step beyond the safety of caution into the unknown. The moment stretched, a fragile breath held suspended in time. And then, just as the candle's flame wavered, she felt the brush of his fingers along the back of her hand, a tender, deliberate stroke that sent shivers cascading down her spine. It was a touch full of promise, of unspoken questions and waiting answers, a caress that spoke of things yet to come. She leaned into it, closing the space between them, letting the silence swell with possibility. Their breaths mingled, soft and slow, as the flickering shadows played across their faces. The world outside ceased to exist, and all that remained was the warmth of skin against skin, the scent of herbs and wine and desire, and the fragile, electric thread that connected them, quiet, unbreakable, and alive. The fifth course arrived with a gentle authority, its presence undeniable in the quiet room. The soft clatter of the plate being set on the table echoed faintly, a tender punctuation in the growing intimacy that enveloped them. This dish was more than sustenance. It was a carefully crafted narrative, a confession plated in rich colors and deep flavors. The short ribs, braised for hours until tender beyond expectation, rested atop a bed of caramelized onions and wilted greens that shimmered with a delicate gloss. A dark, glossy glaze curled around the edge of the plate, catching the flickering candlelight like liquid midnight. Yet it wasn't the taste alone that commanded her attention. It was the unspoken story woven through every ingredient. The weight of emotion simmered and sealed within the tender meat. He watched her from across the table with a quiet intensity that unsettled and intrigued her simultaneously. His gaze was steady, unwavering, yet there was a flicker of something more, a raw vulnerability, an urgent, unguarded truth that barely peeked out from beneath the carefully constructed exterior. She sensed the tension that had been simmering beneath their polite exchanges. The careful dance of conversation and glances was now thickening into something undeniable, something that demanded to be faced. This moment was no longer just about the future of a restaurant or numbers on a balance sheet. It was about something far more fragile and urgent about them, and the unspoken desires tethered tightly beneath the surface. Her fork hovered hesitantly, the metallic gleam catching the candlelight as she paused between bites. The air was thick with anticipation as she searched his face for answers, She didn't know how to ask aloud. Finally, in a voice low and heavy with years of held-back truths, he began to speak, unraveling the tightly woven threads of silence. "It's not only the kitchen that's struggling," he confessed quietly, his eyes locked on hers. "It's me, fighting to keep myself together in the ruins." The words hung in the space between them, dense and raw, like smoke curling from a dying fire. She felt the weight of his confession settle deep within her chest, pressing against her ribs with an unexpected heaviness. There was no bravado here, no attempt to soften or distract. Just the naked, unvarnished truth of a man who had battled storms both outside and within, who carried scars no one else could see. Her breath hitched imperceptibly as she absorbed the gravity of his admission, feeling a strange tenderness bloom amidst the ache. This was the moment where facades crumbled, where the vulnerability beneath the surface dared to be seen. It was a crack in the armor she had long assumed was impenetrable, a glimpse of the fierce, wounded spirit beneath the chef's stoic exterior. Without thinking, her hand reached out across the table, fingers brushing gently against his in a gesture of silent support and solidarity. The contact was electric yet soft, a promise made without words that she would stand beside him in this battle, that he was not alone in carrying the weight of his struggles. The room seemed to breathe alongside them, the flickering candle casting moving shadows that danced along the worn stone walls, as if bearing witness to this tender, fragile moment of connection. It was not merely a revelation of hardship, but a testament to resilience, a shared understanding that deepened the invisible thread linking them together. His gaze dropped to their joined hands, tracing the delicate lines of her wrist with a tenderness that belied the hardness of his life. "The hardest fights," he murmured, voice rough but sincere, "aren't always waged in the kitchen. Sometimes the fiercest battles are the ones we fight inside ourselves. The debts, the failures, the quiet despair that lingers after the last customer leaves." The admission was both a confession and a challenge, and she felt her heart tighten in response. She had arrived as a pragmatic investor, trained to calculate risks and returns. But here, in this intimate space, those cold equations dissolved into something more raw and human. It was a reminder that behind every venture was a beating heart, aching to be recognized, to be understood. Her voice trembled slightly as she replied, the words spilling forth with a sincerity she hadn't expected to find in herself. "I don't just believe in your kitchen, or the promise of success. I believe in you, the man who stokes the fire, who keeps going even when it feels impossible. The soul that feeds hunger beyond appetite." The warmth of her confession spread through her like a quiet fire, casting light into the shadows that had guarded her own heart for too long. She saw his eyes soften, a flicker of hope igniting in their depths, as if her words were a balm for wounds he had long carried in silence. He nodded slowly, absorbing her declaration with a gravity that deepened the space between them. "It's rare," he said, voice thick with emotion, "to find someone who doesn't just want a recipe for success, but who wants to taste the journey, the failures, the scars, the moments of unexpected grace." His hand squeezed hers lightly, grounding them both in the storm of vulnerability and desire swirling around them. The firelight played across his features, revealing the complexity of a man who had been broken and was learning to heal, who dared to open his heart despite the risk of pain. The atmosphere thickened with unspoken promises and a charged anticipation neither dared to break too soon. The kitchen's warmth seeped beneath her skin, igniting a yearning that transcended the culinary, blossoming into something profoundly human and intimate. She found herself leaning closer, drawn not only by the exquisite taste of the meal, but by the man who had crafted it with such painstaking care and brutal honesty. The air between them pulsed with the quiet rhythm of two souls navigating the precarious dance of desire and restraint. His breath brushed against her ear, a whisper carried on the heat of the room. "There's more to this night than plates and numbers," he murmured, his voice low and smoky. There's a hunger that's been growing quiet but relentless. I've tasted it in your eyes since you walked in. The confession was a delicate thread, spun between them, fragile and luminous, a bridge spanning years of silence and unspoken longings. She dared to meet his gaze fully, surrendering to the warmth of the moment without hesitation or fear. Their fingers intertwined, pulsing with an electric charge that spoke louder than words ever could. It was a surrender to the unknown, a leap into a space where vulnerability became strength and desire a language spoken in touch and glances. The walls she had built to protect herself began to crumble beneath the weight of this new truth, the fragile architecture of distance giving way to raw connection. The flickering candlelight cast ever-moving patterns across their faces, shadows alive with the tension that bound them in this intimate dance. She felt his hand slide slowly from her wrist to the small of her back, a gesture both possessive and protective, igniting a trail of warmth that rippled through her entire body. The moment was a delicate balance of contrasts, restraint and abandon, silence and confession, distance and closeness, wrapped in the soft embrace of the evening's golden glow. Their breaths mingled, slow and deliberate, as if the world had narrowed to just this suspended point in time. He leaned in with a deliberate slowness, lips hovering just shy of hers, the space charged with the electricity of anticipation. She held her breath, poised on the edge of what was about to unfold, the cusp of an irreversible shift. His voice was a soft promise, wrapped in the warmth of a whispered confession. "Tonight is not merely a meal," he breathed. "It's a reckoning." Her heart thundered in response, caught in the thrilling tension of risk and reward, of desire and surrender. The rigid barriers of business and circumstance melted away, leaving only two souls laid bare in the candlelight's gentle glow, tasting the bittersweet flavor of possibility. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with trembling reverence, anchoring herself in the fragile moment that balanced between hesitation and abandon. Then, with the slow inevitability of a tide pulling her forward, he closed the remaining distance. The brush of his lips was a gentle claim, a question posed without words, answered with equal tenderness. The world outside ceased to exist, swallowed by the fierce heat that flared between them. The meal was forgotten, the room faded into shadows, and all that remained was the taste of revelation, the ache of connection, and the unspoken desire that finally found its voice in a kiss that spoke volumes. The sixth course arrived not as a dish, but as a moment suspended in time thick with anticipation, charged with the electric hum of unspoken promises. The room seemed to shrink around them, walls breathing in sync with their heightened senses, as if the very air carried the weight of what was about to unfold. The table between them felt less like a barrier and more like a fragile thread tethering two souls on the brink of surrender. Every flicker of candlelight painted shadows that danced across his face, revealing the sharp planes of determination, softened by the vulnerability glimmering in his eyes. The space was heavy with the unsaid, a tension that vibrated through every fiber of their beings, making the silence between words almost unbearable, yet impossibly sweet. His fingers brushed hers once again, this time with a gentle insistence that sent ripples of warmth spiraling up her arm and settling deep within her core. It was not a touch born of haste, but a slow, deliberate caress that spoke of restraint and desire tangled in a delicate embrace, a promise of something neither was quite ready to name, but both desperately wanted to explore. She felt herself melting into the moment, her breath catching in a rhythm she hadn't known she craved, as the scent of rosemary and citrus mingled with the natural heat, radiating from their bodies, crafting an invisible perfume that wrapped them both in an intimate cocoon of anticipation and need. He leaned forward, his voice a low murmur, barely above a whisper. "There's a story in every flavor, every texture. But tonight, I want to tell you one without words." The promise lingered between them like a secret shared in the dark, weighted with a tenderness that made her heart flutter and her skin tingle. Her eyes locked onto his, wide and trusting, silently inviting him to cross the distance that still separated them, daring him to break the fragile barrier of etiquette and expectation. The room fell into a hush, as if even the world outside the window had paused to witness their quiet unraveling. Every breath they drew measured and significant. Their hands intertwined with a newfound urgency, fingers exploring familiar paths with tender curiosity, as if mapping territories previously uncharted but deeply desired. The warmth of his skin against hers was electric, a steady pulse that echoed the growing fire between them. She felt the soft press of his palm against the small of her back, a grounding touch that tethered her to the present, even as their minds and bodies drifted towards something more ephemeral, something akin to a shared dream that blurred the lines between reality and longing. The flicker of the candlelight seemed to grow stronger, casting a golden glow that bathed them in a private warmth they felt sacred, untouchable by the outside world. Their faces inched closer, breaths mingling in the narrow space where the scent of his cologne blended with the faint aroma of smoked spices from the kitchen, a heady mixture that seemed to ignite every sense. Her pulse quickened, every nerve alight with the exquisite torment of anticipation, a delicious tension that made her fingertips tremble and her lips part slightly, craving the softness of his touch. The promise of a kiss hung heavily, a delicate precipice between restraint and abandon, held taut by their shared desire. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, slow and reverent, as if committing the texture of her skin to memory. Her eyes fluttered closed, surrendering to the softness of the moment, allowing herself to be drawn into the gravity of their connection. In the quiet dark, the boundaries between them blurred. The weight of years of guarded emotions and silent longing seemed to dissolve, leaving only the raw, unfiltered connection pulsing in the space between their lips. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle meeting of breath and touch that held the promise of more, a whisper of everything they had denied themselves, a fragile bloom in the fertile soil of their shared vulnerability. It was a kiss that tasted of smoke and wine, of patience and hunger, that unfolded slowly like a secret being revealed for the first time. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, awakening muscles and memories dulled by time and caution. His hands found her waist, fingers tracing the curve of her body beneath the soft fabric of her blouse, igniting sparks that radiated outward in waves of heat. She responded in kind, fingers tangling in the worn fabric of his shirt, drawing him closer until the distance was nothing but a forgotten notion. The room seemed to pulse with their shared energy, every sound amplified, the soft rustle of clothing, the quiet intake of breath, the rapid beating of hearts pounding in synchrony. The heat between them swelled, a tide that threatened to pull them under in its relentless pull. Time became fluid, a slow river carrying them deeper into the night's unfolding passion, where every moment stretched and thickened with meaning. The table, once a boundary, was now forgotten, pushed aside like a relic from a world that no longer mattered. His lips traveled from hers to the curve of her neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake that made her arch instinctively into his touch. The heat pooled low in her belly, a hunger that had little to do with the food they had shared. It was a hunger born from years of restraint and longing, finally given space to unfurl and roar in the quiet sanctuary of the candle-lit room. Their movements were careful yet urgent, a dance of discovery that balanced between control and surrender, a rhythm as old as time itself, yet uniquely their own. The faint scent of citrus and spice lingered on his breath, mingling with the heady warmth of their proximity. He whispered her name soft reverent, as if tasting its syllables for the first time, committing them to memory. She responded with a breathless smile, eyes bright with the thrill of shared secrets and newfound desire, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight played across their bodies, highlighting the contrasts of softness and strength, vulnerability and resolve, a visual symphony that celebrated their union. The air was thick with the scent of anticipation and sweat, the silent music of skin meeting skin in slow, measured rhythm. Every touch was a question and an answer, a language spoken without words, understood fully by both, as their bodies became instruments of unspoken confessions. They moved together toward the kitchen, where the heat of the stove merged seamlessly with the heat between them, blurring the lines between hunger for sustenance and hunger for connection. The cool marble countertop pressed against her back as his hands roamed with deliberate care, exploring, claiming, worshiping every inch of exposed skin. The taste of wine lingered on their lips, a reminder of the night's beginnings and the promise of what was yet to come. The flicker of flames from the stove cast a golden glow, bathing them in light that seemed to pulse with their shared heartbeat, sensing breath and movement in a silent dance. He paused to brush a stray lock of hair from her face, his fingers warm and steady, grounding her in the moment. "You're here," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "And I want you to know this moment is ours." The sincerity in his tone wrapped around her like a soft blanket, easing the last remnants of doubt and hesitation. She nodded, feeling the full weight of his words settle deep in her bones, as if they had been waiting for this truth all along. Their bodies pressed closer, fitting together with a familiarity born, not of time, but of undeniable chemistry. An intimate puzzle snapping into place after years of yearning. The world outside the kitchen, outside the night, slipped away, leaving only the raw, fierce connection of two souls unafraid to claim their hunger. The flickering light and the scent of the night's meal wrapped around them, a silent witness to the unfolding of something rare and precious, something that transcended the physical and touched the very essence of who they were. As the night deepened, their breaths and touches grew more urgent, more demanding, a crescendo building to a climax that neither dared to rush, but both longed to reach. Clothes slipped away like leaves falling in a gentle breeze, revealing the landscapes of skin and muscle beneath, each curve and contour a sacred terrain to be explored with reverence. Every inch explored with care and devotion, every sigh and moan a note in their private symphony of pleasure and connection. The heat between them became a fire that could not be tamed, a consuming blaze that threatened to burn away all doubts and fears, leaving only the purity of their shared passion. The night stretched endlessly before them, a canvas painted with touches, kisses, and whispered confessions that bound them ever closer. In the quiet aftermath, as they lay tangled amidst the soft glow of candlelight and the lingering scent of wine and spices, the world felt both impossibly vast and intimately small. It was a space carved out by their shared vulnerability, a sanctuary where desire and tenderness coexisted in perfect harmony. The night had transformed from a simple meeting to an encounter that would echo in their memories, a flame that would burn long after the last embers faded, a story written not in words, but in breath, skin, and the sacred dance of two hearts finally unbound. The seventh course was no longer about food. It was a sacred moment where every sensory boundary between them dissolved, and the quiet space of the room became a crucible for something far greater than taste or scent. The air was thick with the unsaid, vibrating softly with the rhythm of their hearts, sensing in the shadows. It was a collision of two worlds, fragile and fierce, raw and tender, held together by the delicate thread of vulnerability now fully exposed. Here, in this intimate glow, the dance of their desire unfolded with breathtaking intensity, a slow-burning fire fed by the silent promises held in each breath, each look, each barely there touch. His hand found hers with a gentle insistence. The contact was electric yet soft, as if they both feared breaking the fragile web that had spun itself between them. Their fingers intertwined naturally, the rough texture of his skin against the smoothness of hers, grounding the overwhelming rush of emotion. That single touch sent a ripple of warmth flooding through her, igniting a swell of feeling in her chest that was equal parts longing, nervousness, and a fierce exhilaration that made her breath hitch. The room, once full of fragrant spices and flickering candlelight, now felt charged with a different kind of heat, the heat of two souls beginning to fuse in a moment that was at once terrifying and breathtakingly beautiful. Her eyes locked onto his, and in that gaze she saw an ocean of emotions, the shadows of past hurts, the ache of isolation, the fierce hunger for connection, and understanding that no words could fully express. It was a look of raw honesty, disarming and powerful, that unraveled the carefully constructed barriers she had carried for so long. His voice, low and husky, cut through the charged silence when he finally spoke. "I've been waiting for this. Waiting for you." The words dripped with a tenderness that took her by surprise, falling like silk over the space between them, wrapping them in a quiet vow of devotion and desire that needed no further explanation. He drew her gently closer, his touch feather-light, but filled with an undeniable intent. Their bodies came together with a natural ease, as if they had been orbiting one another for years, finally collapsing into the gravity of this shared moment. The heat between them ignited into a roaring flame, one that erased all doubts, fears, and hesitations. His lips met hers again, deeper, more urgent this time. A kiss that spoke volumes of passion long held back, of promises whispered in the dark, of a fire unleashed with breathtaking abandon. Her arms found their way around his neck, pulling him closer as if trying to meld their very beings in the tender yet fierce embrace. Their connection quickened like a melody speeding up, a rhythm that echoed in their chests and spilled out into every nerve ending. The warmth of his hands gliding along her back sent shivers rippling through her skin, a delicious electric current that seemed to set her entire body alight. Every movement, every sigh, every trembling breath was part of a wordless conversation, a symphony of sensation that transcended speech. Time slowed and unfolded around them, leaving only the now, two bodies entwined in the sacred dance of desire and surrender. They moved together in a dance older than words, a language of touch and breath and silent invitations. His fingers traced the contours of her skin with reverence, committing every inch to memory like it was a sacred manuscript. She responded with equal tenderness, her hands exploring the strength and softness of him, seeking out the man beneath the chef's calm exterior, a man shaped by hardship and hope, resilience and longing. Their bodies spoke in a dialect only they understood, a dialogue of electricity and warmth that pulled them ever closer to the edge of abandon. Outside the sanctuary of their embrace, the world ceased to exist. The room was a cocoon woven from candlelight and the scent of rosemary and aged wine, a space where nothing mattered except the dance of their mingled breaths and the rising tide of their passion. Their mingled exhalations created a heady perfume, thick with desire and promise, that filled the space between them and blurred the lines of self and other. Every heartbeat was a drumbeat to which their bodies responded, every glance a spark igniting a flame that could not be contained. His voice broke the silence again, a low murmur thick with emotion. "You're mine now, in this moment." The possessiveness in his tone was gentle, protective, a claim made not out of ownership, but out of the deep care that comes from finally allowing oneself to be vulnerable. She trembled in response, a soft moan escaping her lips as her body arched instinctively toward his warmth, eager to meet the fullness of the desire they had both held at bay. The boundaries between them continued to dissolve, replaced by a fragile yet unbreakable trust. Their lips parted only to deepen the kiss, tongues exploring each other with the delicacy of a painter's brush and the intensity of wildfire. Every sense was heightened. The taste of wine and spice lingered on their mouths, mingling with the warmth radiating from their bodies pressed close. The faint scent of the kitchen still clung to him, the earthy aroma of olive oil and charred herbs, weaving into the heady mix of heat and longing. The moment hung suspended, a fragile bubble of intensity, poised on the edge of something irreversible. Her fingers slipped beneath the fabric of his shirt, tracing the taut planes of his back, feeling the strength beneath skin warmed by fire and passion. His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing away loose strands of hair as if committing every detail to memory. This connection transcended physical touch. It was spiritual, emotional, a fusion of two souls daring to lay themselves bare without pretense or fear. Their bodies were no longer separate. They were joined in a sacred union that pulsed with electric energy and quiet devotion. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface for so long now erupted in waves of warmth that coursed through them both, igniting every nerve ending with thrilling intensity. She could feel the magnetic pull between them, an irresistible force that neither wanted nor could resist. Each breath was a silent pledge, each heartbeat a drumbeat echoing the promise of new beginnings, dangerous yet beautiful. The flame between them was both destruction and creation, burning away old scars to reveal something new and alive. As they clung to each other, the silence around them grew loud with unspoken meaning. Words had become unnecessary, replaced by whispered gasps and tender caresses that spoke volumes in their softness and urgency. He traced the delicate line of her jaw with gentle fingers, trailing down to the curve of her neck where her skin was warm and inviting. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the storm of sensation washing over her, each touch a wave breaking against the shores of her desire. In that moment, everything outside their embrace vanished. The candlelight flickered across their skin, casting dancing shadows that seemed to hold their own secrets. The softness of their touch and the intoxicating taste of surrender filled the space between them, weaving a tapestry of passion and tenderness that was at once fragile and unbreakable. It was a fusion not merely of flesh, but of hearts, an emotional crescendo that left them breathless, trembling, utterly alive. She felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek, a pulse that anchored her in the truth of this moment. The promise of more hung thick in the air, palpable and sweet like the lingering spice on her tongue. They were no longer strangers, no longer merely chef and investor. They were two souls entwined, bound by the heat of the night and the depth of a desire finally acknowledged. The night stretched before them, full of possibility and whispered promises yet to be fulfilled. As they held each other close, the candle's flame danced once more, casting elongated shadows that moved like whispered secrets across the stone walls. The room bore silent witness to their fusion and emotional climax, a turning point that would forever alter the course of their intertwined lives. And in that soft, flickering light, everything felt possible. Everything felt like the beginning of a story that neither was ready to end. After the fierce storm of passion that had surged between them, the air finally softened, folding into a slower, more deliberate rhythm that felt like the gentle settling of waves on a quiet shore. The room, bathed in the soft flicker of candlelight, seemed to breathe with them, exhaling the intensity of what had just passed and inhaling the delicate promise of what remained. It was a moment suspended in time, where the world beyond these four walls receded into a distant hum, and all that existed was the shared space between their bodies, the fragile warmth of skin against skin, and the unspoken language that only silence can speak. She leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of his heart beating beneath the fabric of his shirt, a grounding force in the swirl of emotions that cascaded through her. Each beat was a gentle drum, a reminder that amidst uncertainty and unspoken fears, here was a steady presence she could hold on to. His hand moved with a feather-like touch along her back, tracing slow, looping circles that felt like the soft brush of a painter's brush against a canvas, each movement deliberate and tender, conveying care without a single word. The warmth of his fingers lingered like a promise, a delicate tether binding them in the fragile quiet of the moment. Their breaths intertwined in the hush that had settled around them, shallow and synchronized, creating an intimate rhythm that felt sacred and serene. Her eyes fluttered closed as she surrendered to the embrace of stillness, allowing herself to be enveloped by the comforting press of his body, the faint scent of smoked herbs clinging to his skin, blending with the coolness of the night air seeping through the cracked window. This was a silence full of meaning, not empty, but rich with layers of emotion, a tapestry woven from trust, vulnerability, and the tender ache of connection. The subtle aroma of his skin mingled with the lingering hints of rosemary and charred butter from the kitchen, wrapping around her senses like a delicate perfume that tethered her to this moment, to him. It was a sensory reminder of the journey they had shared, the heat of the stove, the precise dance of flavors, the ebb and flow of desire and restraint, all culminating here in this quiet sanctuary of presence and tenderness. She breathed deeply, savoring the complexity of the sense, as if inhaling the story of their unfolding intimacy itself. He tilted her chin up with the gentlest of touches, their eyes locking in a gaze that held all the softness and strength of unspoken promises. There was no need for declarations or grand gestures. This simple act spoke volumes, a quiet testament to the trust they were building, the fragile walls beginning to crumble under the weight of genuine connection. His eyes searched hers with a reverence that made her chest swell, stirring feelings she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a mixture of relief, longing, and a tentative hope that maybe this could be different. Her fingers found his again, their hands intertwining with a tenderness that contrasted with the heat of earlier moments. The slow weaving of their fingers was a silent conversation, a reassurance that despite everything, the fears, the doubts, the past scars, here, in this shared space, they were safe. The warmth radiating from their joined hands spread through her like a soothing balm, grounding her in the present and promising a future shaped not by haste, but by patience and care. Outside, the city's nocturnal quiet stretched endlessly, but inside this intimate room, the silence hummed with life, the gentle rustling of fabric, the faint crackle of candle flames casting playful shadows on the walls, the soft inhale and exhale of two souls daring to be seen. This was not the silence of absence, but of presence, a sacred pause that allowed space for reflection, healing, and the delicate unfolding of something new and beautiful. It was the kind of silence that only true connection can cultivate, a moment pregnant with all the possibilities of what love and desire might become. She traced a slow line along the curve of his jaw, marveling at the contrast between the rough stubble that scratched softly against her fingertips and the warm, yielding skin beneath. Each small gesture became a meditation, a way to anchor herself to the here and now, to the delicate intimacy they had carved out of the night. His skin was alive beneath her touch, warm and steady, and with every movement, she felt a current of electricity pulse through her, both calming and thrilling. He whispered her name, soft and low, a barely audible breath that sent a shiver cascading down her spine. That single sound held a universe of meaning, desire, care, reverence, and a promise, all rolled into one fragile syllable. Her lips curved into a slow, radiant smile, a quiet acknowledgment of all they had shared and all the whispered hopes that lingered in the space between them. That smile was an unspoken vow, a fragile bridge between past wounds and future possibilities. Their bodies remained entwined, the tension melting into a gentle embrace that felt like coming home after a long journey. She leaned deeper into the warmth of his chest, surrendering fully to the steady pulse beneath her cheek and the tender strength that radiated from him. Time stretched and folded, the moments slipping into one another like a soft lullaby, unhurried, graceful, full of promise and peace. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. It was a small, intimate gesture, but one that carried the weight of unspoken words, a silent vow to protect, to cherish, to be present. In his eyes, she glimpsed a flicker of a future, painted with soft light and shadow, wild with possibility, yet grounded in trust and care. The world outside had faded away, leaving only this quiet tableau of two hearts slowly weaving together in the gentle stillness. The rhythm of their breathing grew slower, deeper, a shared cadence that bound them in a sacred dance of presence and acceptance. This moment transcended the physical, touching something far deeper, the essence of vulnerability, trust, and the willingness to meet another without fear or pretense. It was a communion of souls, quiet and profound, unfolding in the soft flicker of candlelight and the warmth of their entwined bodies. She nestled closer, feeling the steady heat of him beneath her skin, the quiet strength that had carried him through every hardship, every hope, every longing. In this closeness, she found refuge, a sanctuary from the harshness of the outside world, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light can be found in the presence of another who truly sees you. The candlelight flickered once more, casting gentle shadows that danced across their bodies, weaving a pattern of light and dark that seemed to echo the complexity of their connection. It was as if the room itself breathed with them, alive with the tender energy of two souls slowly finding their way toward one another in the hush that followed passion. In this sacred pause, they found not just comfort, but a quiet joy, the kind born from being truly seen, held, and accepted without condition. He whispered against her skin, voice low and steady, "Stay with me." The words were a soft promise, a silken thread wrapping around her heart. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his breath wash over her, surrendering to the tide of tenderness flowing between them. In that moment, there was nowhere else she wanted to be, only here, in this fragile cocoon of silence and love. The night cradled them gently, holding their shared quiet like a precious secret. And in that stillness, they discovered a new kind of intimacy, one born not from grand declarations or fiery passion, but from the simple, profound act of presence, the shared breath, and the gentle holding of space for each other's being. This was the quiet after the storm, the soft landing of two hearts learning to beat as one. The room softened into a cocoon of amber light as the candles flickered gently, their flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper secrets onto the worn wooden walls. The air was thick with the scent of aged wine, mingling with the faint aroma of herbs and spices lingering from the meal. The world outside had faded to a distant hum, leaving only the quiet intimacy of this shared space between them. The stillness was not empty, but charged, pregnant with the weight of things unsaid, feelings too tender to voice, and a fragile trust beginning to bloom in the quiet. She traced the rim of her glass with a slender finger, feeling the coolness of the crystal against her skin as her gaze settled on him. His face was illuminated in the flickering light, each line and shadow telling stories of years lived hard and with fierce passion. The usual armor he wore, of confidence, reserve, careful control, seemed to have slipped away, replaced by something more vulnerable, more real. She leaned in slightly, invited by the softness in his eyes and the slow cadence of his breath, ready to listen, to understand. His voice, when it came, was a low murmur, thick with memory and unspoken longing. He began to unravel the story of his life, the years when the kitchen had been both sanctuary and battlefield, where every dish was a battle against despair and every satisfied customer a small victory against the tide of doubt. He spoke of sleepless nights, of debts that weighed heavier than any ingredient, and of the relentless drive to create something beautiful despite the odds. Each word was a fragment of his soul laid bare, and she felt the fragile threads of connection tighten around her heart. There was no grand gesture or dramatic reveal, just the quiet dignity of a man who had fought hard and still fought, whose passion burned even as his body tired. She felt a swell of something deep and unexpected admiration, yes, but also a tender ache for the loneliness that shadowed his eyes. It was a loneliness she knew well, one she carried hidden beneath her own polished exterior, and suddenly their world seemed less distant. In turn, she shared her own truths, her voice soft yet steady as she peeled away the layers of business acumen and steely resolve to reveal the true woman beneath the sacrifices made for success. The nights spent wrestling with doubts no boardroom could see, the quiet spaces where ambition had demanded everything but left little warmth behind. She spoke of the isolation that sometimes came with power, the cost of climbing higher, and the yearning for a connection that transcended transactions and contracts. Her confessions were a fragile offering, but one met with open arms. The space between them seemed to contract, closing the physical distance until it was less about inches and more about the emotional currents flowing freely in this candlelit room. His hand found hers on the table, a slow, deliberate touch that was at once grounding and electrifying. The warmth of his skin seeped into hers, sending a ripple of heat that spread beneath her ribs and up her neck, awakening nerves she hadn't known lay dormant. They exchanged memories, next snapshots of lives shaped by love and loss, by choices that had brought joy and by those that carried regret. He spoke of a past romance, a love that had burned bright but ended in silence, leaving only the scent of jasmine and bitter sweetness. She shared moments of youthful dreams deferred and the ghosts of opportunities that slipped through her fingers like sand. Together, these stories wove a tapestry of longing and resilience, fragile and yet unbreakable. Between these shared recollections, silences deepened, not uncomfortable, but filled with the unspoken understanding of two souls, daring to bare themselves without fear. The candlelight flickered, casting gentle shadows that danced across their faces, as if the room itself was holding its breath in reverence to their unfolding intimacy. The air seemed to hum with the promise that here, in this sacred space, they could be wholly seen and wholly accepted. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering on the softness of her skin, tracing the delicate curve of her jaw with reverence. The touch was tender, electric, a language spoken without words. She closed her eyes momentarily, surrendering to the sensation, a quiet surrender, born of trust and the sweet ache of desire restrained only by respect. Her voice emerged as a whisper, vulnerable yet firm. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me with this part of yourself." Her words hung in the air like a delicate perfume, infused with gratitude and the fragile hope of something new taking root. His eyes shimmered, reflecting the dance of candlelight and the depth of feeling that neither dared to name aloud just yet. He replied with a softness that seemed to cradle her words like a precious gift. "It's easier to be brave when someone holds the light for you," he murmured, his hand rising to cup her cheek with gentle certainty. The gesture was simple, but in it lay the weight of unspoken promises and the tender vulnerability of two people stepping towards something unknown. Their gazes locked, a silent conversation flowing between them, intense, patient, and filled with the gravity of shared truths. The room shrank further, becoming a universe defined by breath, by the warmth of touch, by the fragile yet fierce connection looming in the space where shadows met light. Time lost meaning as the night deepened, wrapping them in its quiet embrace. In this cocoon of flickering flame and whispered confessions, they found sanctuary and oasis from the world's relentless pace and the masks they wore beyond these walls. Here, beneath the soft glow, they dared to hope, to dream, and to imagine a future shaped not by fear, but by the courage to be vulnerable together. Her fingers found his, entwining slowly as if weaving a promise in the silence. The pulse beneath their skin quickened, echoing the rhythm of unspoken desires and the electric current flowing between them. The touch was a lifeline, a reminder that in this moment they were no longer alone but deeply, irrevocably connected. The last drops of wine caught the candlelight as she lifted the glass, the liquid shimmering like liquid ruby, rich and full of possibility. She sipped slowly, savoring not just the flavor, but the sensation of being here with him, in this fragile bubble of truth and longing. The night stretched ahead, vast and uncertain, but filled now with the fragile hope that these confessions were the first steps towards something enduring. As the candle's flame flickered low, shadows gathered in the corners of the room like silent witnesses to this delicate dance of hearts. The confessions, memories, and secrets shared in the quiet hours would linger not as burdens but as bridges, fragile yet unbreakable, leading them forward through the unknown terrain of trust and desire. They breathed in unison, a soft rhythm that spoke of new beginnings and the courage to face whatever dawn might bring. The room seemed to hold its breath with them, a sacred witness to the quiet power of vulnerability and the unspoken promise of a love kindled not just by passion, but by the profound beauty of being truly seen. The night had shifted imperceptibly, like the slow and inevitable retreat of a tide, pulling back to reveal a shoreline both raw and vulnerable, shimmering faintly beneath the soft glow of candlelight. The air was saturated with the lingering essence of their shared moments, confessions whispered between breaths, touches that had burned quietly into their skin, and the subtle tension of desire finally acknowledged. Yet now, amidst the fragile remnants of passion, there settled a new weight, quieter, gentler, but no less profound, a tender pause where words hovered in the stillness, fragile and precious like delicate glass, waiting to be cradled or broken. Neither of them dared to break the spell too quickly. Every motion felt laden with consequence, as if a careless gesture might shatter the carefully woven intimacy that had taken root in the shadows between them. She felt it keenly then, the first stirrings of an inevitable distance, a subtle but undeniable shift that often follows moments of profound closeness. It wasn't a rupture or a severing, but rather a gentle ebbing, a slow and deliberate drawing back to allow space. Space to breathe, to reflect, to honor the complexity of emotions tangled up in what they had just shared. Her hands rested lightly upon the surface of the warm wooden table, fingers tracing invisible patterns that mapped the contours of her swirling thoughts and the quiet ache of relinquishing a moment that had already begun to slip away. There was both pain and grace in this necessary separation, a bittersweet dance between holding on and letting go, one she knew was part of the fragile rhythm of human connection. His throat made a soft, uncertain sound, a clearing that seemed to break the spell just enough to open a crack for honesty. His eyes sought hers, holding them with a quiet intensity that wasn't demanding answers, but silently asking for permission to acknowledge the unspoken truth looming between them. In that gaze lay a deep understanding, a mutual recognition that sometimes love or desire, or whatever fragile, shimmering thing had blossomed between them, could not be hurried or forced. It required patience, a tender waiting and nurturing, a respect for timing and the unseen forces shaping their lives. There was a vulnerability there, stripped bare beneath the surface of quiet confidence, and it both unsettled and comforted her. She nodded slowly, the motion deliberate, and waited with emotion. A lump had risen in her throat, thick and warm, a physical manifestation of the turmoil swirling inside her chest. A pause was painful, yes, filled with the ache of uncertainty and the sting of impermanence, but it was also necessary, a moment of grace to honor the fleeting beauty of what they had woven together. Outside, the city began to stir, the distant hum of waking streets and the first tentative steps of dawn creeping beneath the window's frame, gently coaxing the night's cocoon to unravel. Morning was inevitable, relentless in its demands and light, and yet within this fragile sanctuary, time seemed to hang suspended just a little longer. His hand reached out slowly, tentatively, bridging the physical gap that still lingered between them. The warmth of his palm met hers, an electric contrast against the cool wood of the table, grounding her in the present moment even as her mind threatened to scatter in 1,000 directions. His fingers curled lightly around hers, a delicate anchor in the swirling sea of thoughts and feelings, a silent promise of connection, despite the distance now creeping into their lives. The touch was both a farewell and a pledge, fragile and profound, and it sent a current of quiet hope threading through her veins, reminding her that what had begun tonight might not be finished. She breathed deeply, drawing in the mingling scents of rosemary, citrus, and a faint trace of candle wax that still lingered in the air, a sensory echo of the night itself. The taste of wine, dark and lingering, still clung to her tongue, mingling with the bittersweet knowledge that this night, their night, had been a mosaic of flavors, touches, silences, and revelations. It was stitched together with the fragile threads of human connection, woven from the quiet bravery of two souls daring to touch beneath the layers of routine and armor. She allowed herself to hold on to the imperfections of it all, the pauses as much as the passion, and to cherish the raw, honest beauty that only such vulnerability could bring. Words were no longer needed. There was no urgency for grand declarations or sweeping promises that might feel hollow in the harsh light of morning. Instead, they let the silence settle like a soft, comforting blanket, draping over their fragile skin and quiet hearts. Every breath they took became a shared rhythm, a subtle cadence that spoke volumes through its gentle steadiness. In that silence, they found a new kind of conversation, one filled with understanding, patience, and the quiet hope of something yet to come. He rose slowly, deliberately, the soft creak of the chair beneath him punctuating the stillness like a gentle exclamation point. Her eyes followed his movement with a mix of admiration and longing, noting the way his shoulders squared with quiet resolve, even as the shadow of vulnerability lingered just beneath his calm exterior. His presence filled the room in a way that was both grounding and intoxicating, a reminder of the raw humanity beneath the polished surface. He stepped closer, the scent of charred butter and smoky embers wrapping around her like an invisible cloak, igniting a warmth that spread beneath her skin. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted softly, his voice low and textured like the embers fading in a dying fire. "But I want to find out, with you, if you'll let me." The words were simple, stripped of pretense or artifice, yet they carried the weight of every unspoken moment between them. It was an invitation, raw and honest, extended across the fragile space they now shared, a promise to explore the uncertain future together, whatever it might hold. Her gaze softened, a slow, tentative smile curving her lips, a fragile bloom unfolding in the quiet dawn of possibility. She reached up, her fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead with a tenderness that belied the storm of emotions beneath her calm exterior. "I don't know either," she whispered back, her voice barely more than a breath. "But I want that too." The confession hung between them like a delicate thread shimmering in the dawn light, a shared vulnerability that tethered them, fragile but unbreakable. Together, they moved toward the door, reluctant to break the spell but aware that the night as embrace could only hold them for so long. The world outside was awakening, the city stretching and yawning beneath a pale morning sky, indifferent to the profound shift that had transpired within the quiet sanctuary of a candlelit kitchen. Yet in their shared glance there was a quiet defiance, a whispered promise that this was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of something fragile, daring, and deeply real. The soft click of the door closing behind them echoed in the stillness, a delicate punctuation to a chapter filled with fire, longing, and the fragile hope that burns beneath every human heart. The memories of this night, the taste of food, the heat of touch, the whispered secrets, would smolder quietly beneath their skins, waiting patiently for the moment to catch flame again. They carried each other now in invisible threads woven from desire, trust, and the brave willingness to be seen without masks. As she paused at the threshold, turning back for a final glance, their eyes met in a silent exchange that spoke volumes. No promises made, no guarantees offered, only the tender acknowledgement of all that had been shared and the unspoken hope for what might still come. The city's hum rose once more, the day demanding its due, but inside her chest beat a steady rhythm of possibility. She carried the night within her, a secret warmth against the cool dawn, a pulse that whispered of return, of encounters yet to come, of stories still unfolding beneath the slow flicker of candlelight and the quiet heartbeat of two souls drawn together by something greater than chance. The night has unraveled its stories before you, a delicate tapestry woven from the threads of flame, touch, and whispered desire. In the quiet aftermath, when the candles have burned low and the last notes of wine linger on the tongue, there remains something unspoken, a soft, tender pulse beneath the surface that hums with the promise of what may come next. It is the breath held between heartbeats, the space where longing lingers and hope quietly grows. As you rest here now, with the warmth of this moment wrapped gently around you like a familiar shawl, I invite you to stay a little longer in this space we've created together. If the softness of this voice and the unfolding story have found a home within you, consider becoming part of this quiet community, a place where stories like this can breathe and grow, where presence is cherished like the slow flicker of a candle in the dark. A simple subscribe, a gentle like, or a whispered comment is a small gesture that carries weight. A quiet signal that these stories matter, that this connection is real. You don't have to say much. Just let your breath settle, your mind soften, and your heart open a little wider. Share your thoughts, your feelings, or simply the quiet acknowledgement of having been here. Each time you return, you weave yourself deeper into the fabric of this shared experience, helping to keep the flame alive, not only for yourself, but for others seeking a moment of calm, connection, and subtle passion. And so as the world stirs awake beyond these walls and the fragile night slips quietly into dawn, I leave you with this. May you carry the warmth of this story like a secret ember glowing softly beneath your skin. May it remind you that even in silence, in pauses, in the space between words, there is a kind of love, quiet, resilient, and waiting to be discovered again. Thank you for listening. Thank you for breathing these moments into life alongside me. When you're ready, return here, to this voice, this warmth, this story, and let the quiet dance begin anew. Until then, rest well. Let your thoughts drift like smoke through the still air. And remember, the night always holds more than one story, and every ending is simply a beginning waiting to be told.